Good evening. It is 7:03 p.m. This open meeting of the Acton Finance Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth and the local state of emergency declared by the Acton Board of Selectmen and Board of Health due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. I'm sorry, I just saw a chat message happen, which reminds me that I would love to have someone keeping an eye on the chats to let me know if anything happens that needs to be shut off after the bad things that happened at the school committee meeting. We need to make sure that nothing happens here. Continuing, in order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, the Board of Selectmen has suspended all public gatherings, and in accordance with the governor's order, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The governor's order allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations and/or committee votes of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will feature public comment. For this meeting is convening by video conference via the Zoom app as posted in the meeting agenda town's website calendar, identifying how the public may join. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that some attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you and anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording. We are now turning to the first item on the agenda. Before we do so, permit me to cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of our business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes. I will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, I will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Further, please remember to mute your phone or computer when you are not speaking. Please remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. If members wish to engage in colloquy with other members, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. Finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by roll call vote. Okay, I still do not see John here. Christine?
Hey, Christy, Dave Martin pointed out that we can shut off the chat feature. And since we don't use chat for our meetings, you can click on the ellipsis at the bottom of the chat window and select none. And that should take that out of the equation for our meeting.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
All right, I have done that. Did it
John Mangiarati is actually one of the attendees. Maybe you need
Yes, I just tried promoting him again.
Okay.
But thank you. It's been this sort of day for me with technology. I apologize for this. Wish I could do something else.
Can he reuse one of the panelist links, specifically the panelist link that we all get, if we forward that to him and he goes in that way?
Oh. Hold on, sorry.
I just sent in mine, Christine, like a minute ago, just in case. So
Okay,
we'll see. He might come in as me. So
that would be. Yep, he did. He's come, or at least now they're.
that means I can go, I think.
Yeah, you're covered.
Awesome.
All right. I think I'm here now. Hey,
Wonderful.
There you are.
That's not my name.
Oh, well.
You might, I think you can change your name. If you hover over your picture and then, that doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
So, hi, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Nice to see you all. What did I miss?
I read the opening statement. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we get started, is there any public comment? I see no hands raised among the attendees, so we will continue on to the next item, which is the town's presentation.
Hi.
Hi.
Can people hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Jason says no. You're a little quiet for me.
I wanted to take
Very
a moment
quiet.
to actually, hold on a second. I can't hear anybody. Sorry. How's that? Better?
It's better for me, Jason.
Better.
So before I continue this rough opening here, I wanted to mention something that we just did today that features one of your members. A very exciting project we just launched today called Acton Video Tour. And one of the stars of the show is Sahana. So I hope that you go on the town website and scroll down and check out all the videos that we posted. And we're going to use these to help our local businesses and others understand what's great about this community. And thank you, Sahana, for doing that. So Christy asked me to come tonight to talk to the board, the finance committee rather, about reserves. The reserves discussion I watched most of that at your last meeting, and I think it was discussed at the meeting before that as well, and I think I saw some of that. And I just wanted to, I thought it would be helpful for me to go through the memo that I sent to the finance committee in November, on November 9th. And I think a lot of the things that have been discussed the last few weeks were going around that topic, and some of it was referenced, but I thought it'd be helpful to just go through that and see if there's any questions on some of the contents to make sure that we're all on the same page for the information that we're talking about. So if you recall, one of the issues that we were talking about was reserve levels and what are reserve levels and whether we could use more reserves this year. And we basically operate, actually, I'm gonna see if I have screen sharing ability here. I do. So we operate under different guidance, and one thing that we looked at is, as we look at reserve levels, you say, what policies are you working from? And so I've just brought before you, I did a little bit of research today to try to bring to all of you, and I've included links if you wanted to check it out later. Some of the guiding documents that we use to develop our best practices for how we budget every year. So in 2016, the Mass Municipal said, they put out this paper that said, it's a best practice to have at least 5% of reserves available, or more, depending on the size of the budget and other considerations. So that's one thing. It's helpful. It's a standard. They're a pretty respected organization that we're part of, and we look to them for guidance and best practices. Another one is DLS. They're part of A&F, Administration of Finance, and they're the local services bureau that help us all the time with all the issues that we have. They're saying maintain free cash between 3 and 5%. And that's the standard that I used in the memo that I provided to you. I said that they recommend 3 to 5%. Unfortunately, the guidance that they provided in this December 6th of 18 letter was sort of silent on what they believe is an appropriate level for other reserves, which I know has been a topic that you've discussed a lot here. So I was pleased to find another thing from them that happened actually this year, where they published what they called fiscal health indicators, and there were 12 of them, and number 11 was reserves. And in their discussion of reserves, they stated that they believe a strong fiscal health indicator is maintaining between 7 and 10% of combined reserves. So that was the first time that I'd seen them actually put free cash together with stabilization or other reserves and put a number out there. So I thought that was worth sharing with all of you because it's information that I think is very helpful and it's related to what you've been discussing. So when you look at the memo that I sent you, we're at 5.8 in combined reserves, which puts us at 5.6% of total. So we are, if you look at that standard, we're good with the MMAs from 2016. We're good generally with DLS's guidance, and we're falling a little short about their guidance for combined. But I still think we're in a better position now than we were a few years ago. When we say we have 5.82 million, we have 3.75 in free cash and just over 2 in stabilization. We first started raising, in my memo I outlined that we first started raising concerns about the trend in our free cash and our reserve levels in FY19, which would have been August or the fall of 2018. And at that point, we worked internally to put controls in place to reduce our reliance on reserves to try to get the trend to go back up. We had been trending downward, and it was raising some red flags with with DOR, who actually called us, and with the rating agencies who also were wondering what was going on. So we put measures in place to make sure that we had a strong turn back in 19, and we did the same thing in 20. And so, but as you saw, it's becoming more and more challenging to do reserve replenishment, which is something that was easier when surplus revenues were available. But they weren't last year, and I don't know that they will be this year. So we can't rely on turning, strong revenue to carry us and have our free cash replenished every year. And it's important to me as the town manager when I'm recommending the budget to the town and when recommending a budget to the selectmen, that I know that we have reserves and that we continue to build reserves to help with our capacity for future capital needs. If you watched the selectmen meeting last week, I presented a preview of the 10-year capital improvement program that we're working on and will be presenting as part of the FY22 budget process. And there are several needs for capital that we want to try to invest in over the next 10 years, and having reserves available to support that is a strong position for us to be in. So when I said that DLS called us a few years ago, I think this is what they were concerned with. They did an analysis of combined reserve levels, and they identified that about 28 communities in the Commonwealth had less than 5% in combined reserves. Acton was one of them. And if you look at the map here, the towns that are yellow or red had less than 5%. I think so that, and the median in that study was 11%. So we were in an area of concern, and it certainly was a trend that was going downwards. Just to see the full state, this is the full state here. Again, yellow is what we were. So when the Finance Committee talks about development of reserve policy, I thought that these data points and analysis would be helpful to inform how you go through that process. And also, there's other guidance that this is too much to read, but I can share this with you. It's basically just from the documents I've already referenced. But it's important to have targets and to understand that there's a need to maintain free cash to help with flexibility, but also to have stabilization to help build capacity for capital and other things that need to happen in the community. So that's just a quick hit, and I know that there's questions, and I'm happy to take any questions or follow-up.
Questions? Steve?
Thank you, John. In terms of defining reserves, I think we struggle with the stabilization fund. And in light of your 10-year capital plan and the genesis of the stabilization fund, which was to be for capital or one time. So is it fair to say that free cash is free cash and the stabilization fund is devoted to capital? Or is it the stabilization fund just another form of free cash, maybe requiring more of a town meeting vote in your mind?
In my mind, it's different than free cash.
Okay.
Because it's set aside by 2/3 vote of the town meeting to be pulled out only for something that town meeting wants to approve it under 2/3 vote.
Okay, so when we talk about combined reserves, the definition that we're talking about is free cash, stabilization. Are they counting untaxed levy capacity? Not that we have any, but what goes into the total combined reserves that they reference?
In that case, it was, I believe, free cash and stabilization.
Okay.
General stabilization.
All right, thanks.
Anyone else? Jason?
If we've been concerned about our reserves for two fiscal years now, how do we justify some of the things that we spent our money on? I realize that the Board of Selectmen are the ones that bring the articles to the floor, but surely you give them advice, and surely you tell them if this is a wise choice or not. In particular, the three that I have the biggest problem with in the near past are the Asa Parlin House, the bathroom on the third floor that no one can use for 10 months, and the small business grant. So if we don't have the money to meet our reserve policies, why was it stated that since we have the money and we don't have to borrow it, these are tasks that are worthwhile doing? And did you push back on any of them?
Well, first of all, of the three projects you mentioned, only two were funded through free cash. So
Asa Park House is mostly done through CPC, but I believe you're also planning on putting some money towards it. And I could be wrong on this. Aren't you planning on putting some money towards it through the general fund next year?
no, we haven't developed the budget for next year, but that will not be part of it when we do.
Everything Asa Parlin is strictly going to come out of CPC, correct?
Well, we also received the earmark through our work with our state legislators to help get $100,000 to fund most of the work that we've done to date.
Okay. Did you push back on either of the other two?
Well, the bathroom project is something that we need. We have meetings in that facility with more than 100 people, and we don't have a bathroom.
And we've had meetings in that facility for 100+ years, correct?
Right, and the community is going to use the town hall for the next 100 years. And I don't think it's appropriate to not have an accessible bathroom or a bathroom at all for a meeting room of such stature that we hold very important meetings every week and every day in. And so we had an opportunity to fund capital items, including an accessible bathroom. And I'm very pleased that the work is underway. And I'm happy to share some pictures of the progress if you're interested.
I don't need pictures of the bathroom. I still think it's a bad idea. And I don't believe you can have it both ways, sir. I don't believe you can say we are under reserves, but things that are wants and not needs should get funded.
Well, we had 3 or 4 million in requests last year, and we funded about 600,000 or 700,000. So we didn't just spend every request that came through. We funded
Agreed.
projects.
But by your own calculation, you're $2 million below where you say we need to be, correct?
I'm not sure I'm following you.
Sir, I believe you said that we need to be about 7 to 10% of total spend, and that you're only counting.
I was reporting on what I found looking through DLS website today.
Very well. And you're saying that free cash is the only bucket that you're going to count. If free cash is at 3.75, and we need to be at 7 to 10 million, we are multiple $1 million below where we need to be. So is this a crisis? Is this a reserve crisis or not, sir?
I really don't understand how you're mischaracterizing almost everything I've said so far tonight. So this is very difficult for me to respond to.
Can I step in for a second and hopefully help to clarify? John, when you were discussing earlier the free cash levels, the reserve guidance, specifically for the DLS, where they had the free cash at 3 to 5% and a 7 to 10% of combined reserves, that's in fact, I think what Jason is referring to. Is that correct, Jason? The 3 to 5% of free cash or the 7 to 10% of combined?
Correct.
I think that's where he's getting those numbers. Now, I don't have the numbers right in front of me. You had pointed out that our combined reserves, if you hold on 1 second,
5.8%.
at this point in time are 5.8%. So that has us below the 7% of the DLS recommendation. What I'm hearing you say, John, is while that is their guidance, that is not necessarily something that is used as an internal finance department policy. Is that correct?
Right. So I want to have as much reserves available to help support operations as we can. And I just wanted to share with you 3 different guidance documents that I found to help you with your process tonight of developing a reserve policy.
Thank you. Where I suspect Jason is going with this is one could look at these numbers and think, okay, wait a second, we are at 1% plus short of where we should be on combined reserves. Therefore, no reserve should be spent. I'm hearing from you that that is not the case. If you were to look at the DLS guidance, we're below the 7%. You're not saying that no reserve should be spent until we get up to that 7% lower guidance that they
No,
have.
I'm saying we should look at the needs of the town
Yeah.
and the revenues available and develop a budget to meet those needs within the revenues available, which is what we're doing right now. And I think that having a revenue policy is a great tool for us to use, and I look forward to one being developed here tonight or whenever it happens. And if we're not at the targets, it doesn't, sometimes we have to work to get there. Like if we had this conversation 3 years ago, we'd have a lot more work to get there than we have tonight. So since I got here, my focus has been shifting the use of free cash and reserves away from operations towards capital needs. And we're trending that way. We're doing the best we can to continue that. And at this point, we want to just fund operations, maintain services, and we're going to work out how the best to do that given what we have. As we learn, I mean, one of the reasons we've delayed town meeting is that so we have more information about the revenues, and we still don't have that information. So that's why we're still developing the budget. ALG is going to meet again, I think, in a few weeks, and we're going to continue that process. But we haven't. There's no budget recommendation yet.
Yeah.
And I want to recommend what I know that we can afford, and I don't want to set an arbitrary number to hit or not hit right now because I'm focused on what the needs of the community are.
We also don't want to, it is possible to hear from what you said today that 7% combined reserves is the minimum that should be good for the town. And if that's what we're hearing, that is way outside of the ballpark of what the previous policy was and the numbers we've been looking at. So I suspect part of where Jason was going is a need to understand how much you are going to try to hold within that 7 to 10%. Are we super far apart, or are we somewhere that's workable?
Well, I'm not developing a finance reserve policy. I'm recommending a budget that I know that we need to run the town. I want to have as much reserves as possible. If you look at the MMA's recommendation, we're above that. If you look at the free cash recommendation from DLS, we're there.
Okay.
So if you pick the three things I presented, we're within 2 out of 3. I think it's just a matter, every community makes a decision based on the guidance available on what it thinks it needs. And I just wanted to share those things with you so that you can better make that decision.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Mike.
Second, yeah, I think those numbers are from MMA are based on, I guess, an average of 351 cities and towns, and some cities and towns are not as stable as Acton's. I think communities that are more have their income more reliable and more predictable are not as susceptible to the impact of economic crises. I think their reserves probably don't need to be as generous as other communities that are like, say, a Somerville or more blue collar towns that maybe are experiencing higher unemployment and things of that nature. So I think we have to look at it in the light that it's, these are average numbers for 351 cities and towns, that all economies are not equal. I think our economy is and our budget is probably in pretty decent shape. It's not excellent, but it's pretty good compared to other cities and towns. So I don't think we have to look at the more extreme end of those guidelines. We could come up with our own policy that works for the town it meets whatever our needs are. And I think, let's see what happens.
Christine?
Thanks, John. I actually found that those documents, that information, and that explanation really useful and helpful. In towns where school districts aren't shared with another town, I imagine the school budget is simply part of the town budget. And so the reserve amount of that town would apply to the school and the town's functioning in one fell swoop. Is that accurate?
So schools, communities that don't have a regional, that aren't part of a regional school district, yeah, their budget, the school budget is funded through the town, not as an assessment, just as a department.
Okay, so it's so if you've got a $100 million budget and that's the school and the town, and you've got X number of reserves, it's the reserves for both of those entities, not treated as separate. So we're in an interesting and unique position in that we do have shared school, shared reserves, shared duty to budget. And so we can't actually combine the school's reserves with the town reserves. And yet, if we want to look at the fiscal health of the town as a whole, we should consider that the school has a set of reserves and we have a set of reserves. And so, I don't mind, especially on the combined reserves number of running a little low on some of those recommendations, knowing that we actually do have another pocket of money. It's just not necessarily counted. So just.
But that said, there are many other regionalized school districts. We are by no means unique, even in our neighbors.
Yeah, I'd be curious to look at the regionalized school district towns and see what their town reserves are versus their regional school district reserves are and how we compare.
Yeah. Back at that map John showed us, Concord, Carlisle, and Lincoln and Sudbury were all in the blue above 10% zone.
Feels like a lot of reserves.
Can I jump in with my
Please.
comment? First of all, John, thank you so much for the presentation. It's kind of clear to understand some of these guidelines. I just wanted to go back to one of the comments that Jason made, the couple of projects that he talked about. I know we have talked about this quite a bit in the past, especially one of the things, actually both I should say, but definitely the small business grant program. Eventually, it did go to the town meeting. It is the town meeting people who voted on that. And it was a recommendation, a good recommendation at times like this, which we should acknowledge, to be empathetic towards, our fellow community members. So just wanted to call that out because I think we have had this discussion way too many times. And, I just feel like saying that today.
I'm going to jump in here for a second. In the same way that I cut Jason off some when he was challenging the discussion, Sahana, I don't think coming in and pointing the other way like that is going to help us move this discussion forward. Steve.
Yeah, John. So changing subject slightly, but not totally. When do you anticipate your budget recommendation? Because in my view, it's very difficult to set a reserve policy in a vacuum. And working with the current ALG plan, I find this a very difficult exercise because the spending in the ALG plan is relatively high. And if our reserve position now is about correct, then there's going to be no reserves to put to the budget, certainly not to the out years. So I know you're not done, but when do you think you might be done?
We're going to meet the statutory timelines leading up to the town meeting, which is, I believe it's 100 days before or whatever that is. So we're going to focus on that, which puts us into early March. But I will be prepared to provide some information before then. But we postponed it intentionally. And I think we need to take the time that we have. That's one of the reasons that I understand that it's challenging for you as a committee to try to make decisions without that information. I totally understand it. Like I said, or like Steve said last week, normally at this time, I would have already presented the budget and
Yes.
we'd be planning for our budget workshop. So it's a different year, timeline wise, certainly.
Do you think, well, obviously, a great deal of your budget number is compensation related. So, but what we don't know is state aid for sure. That's not a huge piece of the town budget. It's a bigger piece of the school budget. So it is what you're waiting to find out. I guess, what are you waiting to find out other than what the state's going to do?
We're waiting to find out the revenue picture. Yes, I mean, not just state aid, but receipts locally and how those go. We're interested in what happens with motor vehicle next month. Hoping that's going to be no issue there. But we're not there yet, so we have to wait. There's several things. We're also working very hard to identify ways to deliver services the most effective and efficient way, like we do every year. And we have a few extra weeks or months to do it. So I'm taking that opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? 1 second, John. What got us all on this big discussion was an idea of how much of reserves could be spent. And we had been proposing a level that was going to be significantly problematic, I believe, by the DOR, but was especially by the rating agencies were concerns about that. There has been some discussion on spending down a significant portion of the stabilization fund to help make there be less of a tax increase, and ignoring the logistics of that, the mechanics of it right now. How much of a problem would it cause for the town if we were to spend a good chunk of the reserves, stabilization fund, or free cash?
That's a question for me.
Yeah. Steve Barrett's welcome to answer it.
I'm just double
Let Barrett answer.
I think that's something that I haven't really thought about. I don't know what we would do that for. I think if we need to, if our revenues fall short and we need to supplement them, that would be a reason to do it. But
I think what I'm asking is if the finance committee had returned to you with a policy saying, or a guidance saying, we think reserves should be spent now is the time. At what level does that become problematic regarding the bonding agencies or anyone else who, any other reasons we might not know about external?
I mean, my focus would be to try to sustain the reserve levels where they are, and if we need to go down for some reason because we need to cover a shortfall, I'd want to have a plan to make sure that we're able to send the trend the other direction very soon. So, I wouldn't be comfortable recommending that we spend down the stabilization right now without a specific purpose for doing so. And that's not part of our budget planning at this point.
Yeah. Christine?
So the purpose proposed at our last meeting was, and the one that we've been noodling around with was one of maybe taxpayer relief. I assume there will be some capital needs in the coming year. Stabilization is supposed to be earmarked for capital needs, and so instead of paying for those capital needs out of other buckets, we were considering the idea of paying for some of those capital needs, perhaps even $1 million or more out of stabilization instead of out of the operating budget, leaving the whatever we don't take out of the operating budget that would have gone towards those capital needs, we reduce the tax levy instead. That was the thought experiment. So.
So two purposes. So I can understand the first purpose to fund capital items. I think that's one of the reasons that it was created. So I think that makes perfect sense. And I think the second one, if town meeting directed me to do that, I would, but it's not something I would recommend.
So if you had the tax levy at 2.5%, you had your budget set, and then instead of taxing to the full 2.5%, you taxed some amount less, and the money you expected to get, you still get. You're just getting it out of stabilization instead. Going forward, what issues do you see, or do you foresee with taking that money out of stabilization and using it instead of a tax increase, a portion of the tax increase? I'm not trying to reduce the money you have to do your job.
Well, I think that is using revenue. That's using one-time revenue to fund operations, which is not something that I'm comfortable with, and I've been trying very hard to avoid. So I would rather not do it.
I understand. I understand we don't want to take operating expenses out of stabilization fund, but I also believe we probably, maybe I'm wrong, maybe we don't have $1 million worth of capital needs in the coming year.
We do.
But I assume we do. So paying for those out of stabilization wouldn't be a misuse of that fund. If it's already paid for, then you don't need the money to pay for it out of a full tax levy increase.
Well, as I mentioned, I've been trying to focus our capital investments on the amount that we can afford to do with available free cash, so that I'm hoping to not recommend that we do too much capital out of the operating budget to begin with. So again, this would be using one-time revenue to support operations. To fund capital, I think it's a fine idea, one that we should consider depending on the financial picture, but to fund operations, it's not something that I'm comfortable recommending.
I agree. I don't intend to use the money to fund operations. Maybe the math just doesn't work out as I thought it might if we don't have that much in capital expenses planned anyway.
Well, we like I said, we have probably $7 million in requests, so we could fund $7 million worth of capital. But
No, I'm not looking for new ones. I'm not looking for new ones. I'm looking for already have to.
What I normally would do is try to fund an amount that we can afford based on the amount of reserve that we're able to put towards two, so that there is no impact and there's no need to use revenue generated from taxation for those capital items. So you would be suggesting that we do more capital, which is a
that's
suggestion.
definitely not where I was trying to lead you.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Jason.
Just to circle back, we put forward quite a bit of taxation in the forms of capital overrides, both in the new twin school, and in the upcoming North Acton Fire Station, as well as significant capital overrides for Minuteman. Those are all obligations that we already have to pay. I would request, as you formulate your budget for the coming year, that you realize that is a huge increase to the average single-family taxpayer already, and to please try and mitigate any other increases. I believe that part of the reason that we're having this exercise about reserves is that 6, 7, 8% year-over-year tax increases is unsustainable. And so while we were overdue for some of these big ticket items that we all agreed and voted overwhelmingly to fund, please keep in mind that it's not an infinite bucket of taxation that you can reach from. And we would like you to please look at your operating budget and figure out a way to mitigate large expenses. And I would like to reiterate that what Christine was talking about was not new capital requests. She was strictly saying, take the money to pay for the capital request from stabilization. That was a very clear, that's not an operating cost. Unless your position is that this year's capital requests are a function of operating expenses.
Okay.
Roland?
So my understanding from when the town adopted to have stabilization was that when we had capital projects, we could go and bring it to town meeting floor and say, okay, we have a project for $500,000 and we'd like to take it out of the stabilization fund. Okay, because we already earmarked that stabilization fund for capital projects. So that's where I feel that something that Christine was trying to drive at is saying, okay, we have X number of dollars sitting in stabilization for capital, let's start to use some of that. And not, so if the overall budget is X and $500,000 is gonna say we're gonna have an override for that, but we have the money sitting in stabilization, don't go for the override, take it out of the stabilization fund and use it for the capital project. That's what I think. Is that kind of?
Oh,
Not exactly.
Okay.
That was not. I wasn't looking to offset an override. I was looking for a maneuver within our own guidelines to only use stabilization for capital and to not
Right.
fund operating expenses out of any kind of reserves. That also allowed us to tax under the capacity this year to offer some sort of tax relief to our citizens. And it sounds like that's not likely to work out this year because the capital needs we have aren't high enough to offer an offset, even if we instead paid for them out of stabilization.
I think it's a little more complicated than that, but I think
well,
Sure.
we could decide not to spend any free cash on capital and instead appropriate from stabilization. That would not use our free cash for capital and it would spend down the stabilization fund. It would not.
Accomplish my goal.
Right.
That's what I'm getting.
Yeah.
We have to take it out of one of the reserve buckets and it will not, there isn't more capital otherwise that we could offset. That's within the budget outside of what you're planning to use out of free cash. If I understand.
anyone else? Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Sorry for the rocky start there.
We got you on. That's what matters. You're welcome to leave us if you'd like. Hi, Steve. Oh, you're just saying bye to John? Okay. Now, Mr. Noon sent out what I thought was a very good reminder that where we're trying to get in many ways here is to guidance for ALG. Ideally, we'd know 5 years out, but if you poke around on the ALG spreadsheet, it's pretty easy to realize that you can't get more than 2 years out or 1 year out, depending on what you're trying to get to. So I'm wondering if anyone would like to start a little more from that end on how things should be. Do we want to make sure going into next year we have or the next few years we are building up our reserves? Do we want to be something else, because that thought disappeared. Does anyone have anything to share at this point in time? Or do you want to come at this from a different direction? I can share my thoughts if you want. Final. 1 second. One of my concerns going through this discussion that we've had, I've been reminded through this, I was telling Adam earlier, a coworker who described after we would have these big complex decisions that what we were striving for was the simplicity on the other end of complexity. And I'm really hoping we've gotten through the complexity and we're really close to the simplicity part, because I know this has been a challenging bunch of conversations to have. Let me see. Right now, we are a little more than 3% of free cash. Free cash is a little more than 3% of the total Acton budget, which is within the DLS guidelines. If you add in free cash and stabilization, we get up to 5%, a little more than 5% of the total Acton budget. That is within what Christine recommended as her policy she put forward last time. She had a floor of 3% of the total Acton spend, which was free cash plus stabilization. Please correct me if I'm wrong here, Christine. It would 5% of it as a ceiling. Now, Christine, did that 5% include the E&D or any of that? No. These numbers fit within what John just told us. I don't think we have to work within these guidelines from the various state agencies, but it makes it a much easier conversation. If we're not going to work within that, we need to have a good reason why, just in terms of going into try to persuade people to go with our point of view. So, barring anything else, my inclination is to repropose Christine's policies and then get into a discussion of reserve use, which is where I think things get very interesting in the next few years. Jason, you unmuted. Do you want to say something?
When you're done, I would like to give you my answers to the questions that you sent out earlier this week.
Certainly.
Is
I'm
that
done. Yes, that'd be great.
The first question you asked is, what is the purpose of reserves? It's my opinion that reserves should be used to prepare for the unexpected or to be specifically earmarked to a clearly identified future project. What buckets of money should be considered part of reserves? I believe that free cash, stabilization, enterprise fund retained earnings, and ABRSD, E&D should be used when trying to determine a full amount of what our reserve pictures are. I explicitly exclude CPC because it's a completely different program and it has its own set of rules as to what can get applied to. And I also explicitly exclude ABRSD stabilization because when the money was put into the fund, it was put into the fund with two explicit caveats or purposes. One was a new roof at Parker Damon Building. The other was to fund the 13-year capital improvement plan that was presented at the time of the stabilization request. I do believe that the town stabilization fund should count as regular reserves because though we have asked for years for a multi-year plan, and though we have received the third-party assessment of our municipal buildings 6 or 7 years ago now, we have yet to receive that plan. While I respectfully heard that the town is bringing forward that plan within the next year, my fear is that the plan has been accelerated because there is some expectation that these reserves are going to go away. Should the floor and ceiling use the same buckets for reserves? In a very real sense, even though there are some strings attached to different levels of buckets, this is all taxpayer money. This is all taxpayer money, and money by its very definition is fungible. So yeah, probably we should use the same buckets for both floor and ceiling. Similarly, what should this be compared to? Our previous long-term standing policy measured against a municipal spend versus a total spend. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible and say, if we're going to count all of the buckets as being revenue sources, then I think it's appropriate to use total spend as the measure against which we apply these resources or these reserves. So let's just keep it simple. Let's take all the buckets except for CPC and ABRSD SIP, ABRSD stabilization, and count those as reserves and apply them against total Acton spend. I am fine with a 3% floor and a 5% ceiling. I do not believe that we have to keep in exact lockstep with the town or the schools or DLS. I believe we get to make our own. Policy. It would be best if we were not wildly divergent from the other entities. If this is a project that the ALG would like to take on, I'm not opposed to that either. Get to a consensus view of what our blended reserve policy should be, as a way of mitigating the fact that we are not a more common town that has a single line item, a single unitary budget, because the schools are part of the budget. The purpose of ALG is to mitigate some of the extenuating circumstances of having a regional school district. You also asked what budget. I believe this should be total Acton spend. Budget should be reserved percentage of total Acton spend, 3 and 5%. You said how much reserve should be spent to offset this year's budget. I believe that we have taken out huge amounts of capital expense. Minuteman keeps going up every year. We agreed to a large new twin school. We agreed to a very expensive fire station. I believe it is time to have some taxpayer relief. I believe we as a committee need to agree upon a floor. I propose 3%, and I believe it's time to go to the floor. While I believe it's probably too jarring to do in 1 year, I would expect us to get to the floor in 1 or 2, or at the outside, 3 years. I would also say, if we do follow this policy and get to the floor within 3 years, then it is strongly recommended to the two procuring entities that they realize that it is our expectation to take reserves to the minimum for the foreseeable future, since we have already made very large purchases and will hopefully not have any large needs in the near future. It's time for a little taxpayer relief, and we can build up as the years go on. So my recommendation is we define a floor and get to it within 2 fiscal years.
Any questions? Okay, Mr. Barrett, I have a question for you. You're still muted. I can keep talking. I did a bunch of work today with the ALG spreadsheet, as you know, and it looks like the taxes, the single family tax bill, et cetera, is actually entirely based on the tax levy calculation. So the only way to reduce taxpayer impact would be to apply stabilization, I don't think you can do it with stabilization, would be to apply reserves at that level to offset the tax levy. If we simply spend reserves, it just goes into offsetting the budget shortfall. Is that correct?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see everybody. So I'm trying to understand the question. Right now, the model for FY22 has the town taxing to the full extent of Proposition 2.5. So yeah, if you're looking to change the trajectory of that calculation, you'd have to work on the tax levy and replace taxes with something else. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, you are. So if we wanted to affect the tax bills, we would have to, and wanted to do that with reserves, we would have to come up with a way to, say, use tax reserves to, in effect, pay for part of the tax levy, to decrease the tax bills.
Yeah, in essence, and I think Steve's touched on it before, if that was the committee's desire, yeah, you would propose to use so much of stabilization fund to offset the tax levy.
Now, that gets my next question. Given that stabilization fund is explicitly earmarked for capital, would it be available to be used for this, or would we only be looking at being able to use free cash?
So this is a general stabilization fund. So I think at that point, if 2/3 of town meeting agrees, then that's what it can be used for. That's my general understanding.
Would another option be to maintain the stabilization funds where they are and recommend a lower tax levy increase, potentially building up some untaxed levy capacity?
I'm trying to follow along. I think something falls out of the equation there, whether you have to do cuts or something, but I'm not sure I got that question.
Rather than use stabilization to decrease the tax levy, hold on, I think I got myself lost. Yeah, no, I see the problem. I got myself lost. Never mind. Sorry about that, Lester. Steve Noon.
If you think about the scorecard that we do for town meeting, for those of you that actually spend any time looking at it, we start out by saying what we have to spend for the budgets, and then it goes across in columns as to how we're going to pay for what we're spending. The first one and the biggest one being a tax levy, and then comes reserves and CBC funds and retained earnings from enterprise funds and things like that. So what you have to think about is that spreadsheet. If you lower the amount you say you're going to raise from taxation to pay for the budget, you have to raise the amount you're going to fund from some other source of funds, usually being reserves, free cash, stabilization, however you want to characterize it. You can also have borrowings, you can have all sorts of sources of funds. But anytime you lower the tax levy part of it, something else has to go up to pay for the budgets that have been requested. So, I mean, I have some comments on what Jason said, but, you know, I'll let you finish your interrogation of Steve Barrett.
I think that was pretty much it for me for now. We'll see. Did you want to respond to Jason or what Jason said?
I mean, the only difference I would say is I don't agree on differential treatments of stabilization funds. If the schools have a stabilization fund devoted to capital, and the town has a stabilization fund that was voted in for capital, and they say they have a capital plan. God knows they need a capital plan. I don't see why we should treat one different from the other. As far as the amounts go, yeah, 3% of the total spend is a reasonable floor. However, we're practically there if you only look at free cash. And 5%, if the town has 5% of the total spend, and then we factor in, say, what the schools have in E&D, then yeah, you're getting close to 6 or 7% combined reserves, which is as close as I care to get to those MMA guidelines.
Sir, you're actually higher than that.
Yeah.
Well,
You're at eight and change.
8 and change on
110
10 million something.
Yeah, 106. Yeah.
So my sense would be that should be sufficient. I am concerned on the minimum side that 3% total spend sounds like a good solid minimum for the town's expenses, as long as the schools are in the same range. But since we, as Mike pointed out last time, don't have a whole lot of influence on the schools, if they chose to go to 2 or 1% E&D, then I would feel our minimum might have to go up. But assuming normal operations in the schools, and they're in the 3% range, I'd say 3% is a reasonable target for the town.
Oh, you're saying what our target level should be?
Yeah, I mean,
Not just our floor.
well, I also have an opinion about how well we're going to do when we try and tax people to increase our reserve funds. I don't think we'll do well. So, targets and floors tend to look about the same in my book.
Roland.
So I'm trying to remember back when stabilization was first voted in a town meeting. Does anybody know that answer off the top of their head? Okay.
5 years ago, I don't know.
Let me try
Was
and
it
look
two-
it up. Let me try and look it up. It's 5 or 6.
Okay, so my concern is that we put the stabilization fund in 5 years ago. 15 years from now, the stabilization fund's still gonna be there and it hasn't been touched. You know, so what do you carry in perpetuity and never touch it? I mean, that's kind of some of my concern. I mean, we now found out that we have a dam that we're gonna have to get rid of, and that's could be considered capital because that's a capital thing that has to be done. So I don't know how much that's going to cost. None of us know that at this point. So I mean, I think they should start looking at some of the projects, saying, hey, instead of going for an override or something to fund these projects, we have the money in stabilization. Let's use it. So if you go for an override, that's a tax increase to the citizens. And we've already been taxed at $2 million, a little bit over $2 million of stabilization that we're not using. It's sitting there, and you can look at it as a rainy day fund or whatever. But the net result is we're not making a lot of interest on the thing because interest rates are so low, so it's not growing. And I believe when the interest comes in on those, and Mr. Barrett can correct me if I'm wrong, that interest is flowed to the general fund. It doesn't stay with the stabilization, or am I wrong on that?
No, it stays with the stabilization fund, but you bring up a great point that the interest rates have, pardon the pun, fallen through the floor.
Yeah, and so the money that we're going to expect to get in from retained earnings, from free cash, and interest income is going to be a lot lower than it has in the past this year, especially for the foreseeable next 2 years. The Fed's not raising any rates, so that's going to drive interest income line item. So we can't count on that. And new growth, who knows? That's a projection that could fall short. If the economy still keeps going the way it's going due to the pandemic, and people don't get back to work, there's not going to be any new growth there. That'll only be limited, I should say. So I think the town really needs to look at what projects they have outstanding that they want to fund, start using that stabilization fund.
In this year's plan, in this year's ALG plan, there is $1.15 million earmarked for capital only. Just as an FYI, that is, John is trying to make it so that any reserves spent are only for capital plans.
So if you take a $2 million stabilization fund and you maybe cut that 1.15 down to 1 million, you could use the stabilization fund. You can take $1 million out of the stabilization fund, still have $1 million sitting there for future. And we don't need to fund it out of free cash or out of the operating budget, and take that $1 million, have it as savings on the bottom line, and don't tax the citizens for that $1 million. We've already been taxed for it.
Well, so that's where I got off the rails a little with Mr. Barrett, trying to understand, because as the plan is, if you just stick in another $1 million of reserves, it's just going to decrease the shortfall, not make taxes any lower.
Okay.
Madam Chairman, I
It appears to me is we have a spending problem in this town. We're trying to spend more than what the citizens are willing to fund. The tax is 2.5%. Live within there.
Jason?
Sorry to interrupt. I do have the answer. This was Article 6 of the town meeting held on April 4th, 2016, was to do the initial $1.8 million seeding of the stabilization fund, which was replenished after the Walker property was purchased.
Thank you. 1 second, Steve. Adam?
Got it. Would you like me to share my thoughts on the questions that you put forth?
Certainly.
So, by accounting definition, reserves are basically fall into 3 definitions: unrestricted funds, that are set aside and available for spending. And as such, I believe retained earnings in the enterprise funds are not unreserved, unrestricted. I believe that the reserves set aside for the school are not unreserved or unrestricted because they're not available for general use. And as such, I like the idea, and also I believe that the stabilization fund is also not unrestricted because it has a defined purpose and it's not just available for general use. So as such, I believe that the floor and ceiling discussion that we're having can easily be based and benchmarked upon free cash only. And then those other retained earnings, stabilization fund, and school reserves need to have their own policies and be monitored freely. And I think what I had said specifically, basis your questions that you had sent out, was that when you're doing a floor and ceiling, the school money, the retained earnings all get counted twice, which goes well over and above, which certainly helps to meet and exceed the expectations put forth by the agencies that Mr. Mangiarotti quoted this evening for us. So I really like basing the floor and ceiling off of free cash only, but basing it as a floor of 3% of the total spend and a ceiling basis 5% of the municipal spend, which I think puts us in a very narrow envelope of approximately, what is that, about 2.2 to $3.5 million as a free cash fund. And then when you add all of the other reserved funds to that, that puts us in a very, I think, secure position. And I would say that the stabilization fund as it currently sits needs to go for projects like dam removal, the bathroom in Town Hall, capital projects such as that. That's all. Thank you.
Mr. Noon, did you want to say something, or should we have direct responses to Adams?
Well, I wanted to make one point. It wasn't us that caused the reserve problem. In fact, had the Board of Selectmen followed our recommendations, we wouldn't have had the reserve problem. They spent it on land purchases and things like that. So I am sympathetic to the fact that the money's gone, but to me, it's somewhat, they're getting religion late in the game. And yeah, Roland's comment about the dam is a good example. A lot of people knew there was a problem with that dam, but we went ahead and bought the land anyway. So that to me, is something I think some of our new members should know, that we were right all along on reserves. And I know several of us, kind of get very upset when we hear people saying at town meeting, well, we have the money in reserves. And they have said it in the past, recently. So my concern is that if we set a floor at 3%, which I would like to do, we now have a fairly, as Roland said, massive spending problem coming up on this year's budget, which is why I was trying to get some sense of where the budget discussion calculations are. Because right now, the ALG plan shows a $1.6 million deficit, and we have no way of closing that. And if we recommend a reserve policy of 3%, we won't even be able to, I think, put the amount of money that they have allocated to reserves for this year into the plan. So that's my concern. And it gets back to what I set out earlier in the day about you can't make policy in a vacuum. And one other thing I was going to say, not that I recommend us not being AAA rated, but my recollection of the difference between AA and AAA or single A and AAA is about 20 to 30 basis points per A. So it's not the end of the world. I particularly like being AAA rated, but it would not be the end of Acton if we didn't have it.
Roland?
I guess that also brings the question to Steve Barrett is, how are turnbacks looking this year?
Well, it's a little early, Roland. I mean, you know, the snow's flying a little bit, and we've had a little bit of exposure there. So, you know, I don't think we're going to see a significant turnback on snow and ice, but it's still early there. You know, we're dealing with shifting guidance on FEMA and CARES Act. You know, that being said, on the other hand, you know, the hiring freeze and some of the non-essential spending is still in place, and John's, you know, trying to keep a lid on, you know, spending and holding back hiring. So it's really too early to tell. I do think, though, that when we do the second quarter FinCom report, you know, which will be the end of January, early February, you know, we'll have 6 months in the books at that point, and we'll probably be able to report out, you know, at that point what we're seeing a little bit better.
I think my question is more was the end of the year, you know, end of calendar year spending, I guess is what I should probably say. And then there.
Jason?
If I could just add on to what Steve Noon just said, it is also possible that the spread between AAA and AA may be less than in the past because we are at historically low levels across the board. So it's easier to have a 30 basis point spread when you're talking about a 4% interest rate. It's much harder to do when you're talking about a 2% interest rate. Furthermore, I would also add or reiterate that once we take out the bond for the North Acton Fire Station, and I understand that we tried and the bond market had seized in March and April as a result of COVID. I believe we're currently on a 1-year ban. Is that accurate, Mr. Barrett?
Yeah, 9 months. We shortened it up to about March. We'll be going back out, yeah.
Very good. So once we take out and it is our expectation to take out a 30-year bond in March, correct, Mr. Thank you. Once we take out that 30-year bond in March, while I also do covet our AAA rating, the only time we really care about your credit report is right before you make a major purchase. We have just made multiple major purchases, and I don't believe we have any on the horizon. Therefore, you know, I don't know about everybody else on this meeting, but I knew my credit score very, very frequently leading up to and including the day that I bought my house. I'm not sure I really bothered to look at it since then because I'm not planning on buying anything.
I like to know what my options are. Okay, so what I'm hearing from Adam is free cash only. Christine's recommendation was free cash plus stabilization. Jason wants us all in on everything. Steve, what was your description of what constituted reserves?
Me?
Yeah.
I would say for the purposes of this policy, 3% on free cash.
Free cash only?
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
Can
I have a
I
question.
jump in, Christy?
Oh, yes, please do.
Yeah, I just wanted to give my thoughts on this too. So, you know, since we're just talking about what needs to be included, I would just go with the free cash not to include the stabilization in it or any other funds.
Okay, thank you. Anything else?
That's it.
Now, Mr. Barrett, the ALG plan has, one second, make sure I'm reading the right line. Assumption of reserve replenishment of about $1 million each of the next few years. Presumably, if we keep spending as is listed in the plan, $1 million of free cash every year. We'll keep our free cash level about where it is, but we will not grow reserves, correct?
Yeah, that's the exact math, right?
So the only reserve growth we will get is if there is excess revenue unexpectedly, or the very tiny bit of interest we're getting on the stabilization fund.
Yeah, reserve replenishment can come from a bunch of different places, but the major, as I think John Mangiarotti has said, the major areas in the past have been, excess revenues. Those haven't been really there the last year or two, so we've relied on expense turnbacks. Those are the budget turnback, excess revenues. Those are the main two areas of replenishment.
Thank you. So I'm hearing 3 interests in free cash only. Do we want to have a discussion about that? Jason?
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this properly. Let's be clear. If we're only going to use free cash and we're going to measure it against total Acton spend, then we're making it that much more difficult for the town and the school district to meet the significant shortfall that already exists on the ALG plan. I believe taking all of the resources that we have and treating all the taxpayer dollars that have already been garnered and put into different buckets and then measuring against total Acton spend, I believe that's a lot kinder to both the town and the school district to come up with their budgets. Are we really quite comfortable just using free cash and measuring it against the total Acton spend? If that's the case, there's next to nothing that can be used as reserves in the ALG spreadsheet, unless I'm missing something.
That was part of my point about the 1.1 million. I think it's in there and we still stay within the 3%, no?
Yes. I think I said that, Jason.
I know.
Maybe not as eloquently, but I think I said it.
That's why I'm trying to make it clear for all of my angry rhetoric. I'm actually the one trying to be kinder to the two procuring entities by saying, let's look at this holistically. If we really want to hold their feet to the fire with just free cash, then the situation is dire.
No, it's actually worse than dire. Let me explain what I mean. Once both entities exhaust their capital stabilization fund, we have no mechanism other than turnbacks to replenish them. So to your point, Christy, you're making about as long as we had $1 million in turnbacks, we can use $1 million in the budget. Maybe for a year, maybe for 2, but once the stabilization's gone, there's no way to get it back without allocating those turnbacks to stabilization.
Yeah.
So, 3% of total Acton spend as a floor is perfectly appropriate. It is going to be very difficult to balance this year's budget with that assumption. But we don't, since we don't have the even preliminary looks at the budget, then I can't say in all certainty that we have a disaster on our hands yet. I can suspect that we might, but since I haven't seen any budget numbers, I can tell you that if they don't trim the ones that are in the current ALG plan, it'll be a disaster. But I don't. Again, we need to understand the repercussions of the policy we're setting, but I don't think 3% is that bad a number, because we're making policy for the next 5 years, not just next year.
I'm just surprised that I'm on the gentler side of this argument.
You're surprised. We're all surprised.
Christine?
So I have difficulty getting exercised over a $1.6 million budget gap on a budget that I haven't seen from the town or the school. So it's a thought experiment number that typically goes into the ALG spreadsheet, and until we actually see the budgets, that number is vapor. As far as Jason being gentler and nicer, Jason, you have a 3% floor on a larger bucket of reserves. I'm not convinced that that's gentler or nicer if the goal is to stay closer to the floor. You want to combine the school's reserves and the town's reserves. So
3% of a much larger number when compared against the same Acton spend. It is much nicer
3% of total Acton spend.
as what we're measuring against. But I'm including 3.75 in free cash, 2.07 in 2.07 in stabilization, Acton's share of about 3.6 of E&D. I'm counting another, I think 1.6 or 1.8 of the retained earnings. I'm holding a lot more in reserve than
That reserve is given.
If you're combining all that and wanting us to spend down to the 3% floor, then you're talking about spending an enormous chunk of reserves out of a lot of buckets. And what Adam proposed, and what I think that Steve is agreeing on potentially, is that free cash alone should have a floor of 3%, and that perhaps we should consider all of the other buckets in a different manner because they are not unfettered access the way that free cash is.
Adam is nodding his head.
it all comes out of the taxpayer pocket, though. This is all money that has been taken by the taxpayer,
From the taxpayer.
from the taxpayer, by taxation, yes.
Mike? I can't hear you.
Yeah, I had it unmute. Yeah, I support this 3%. I know it's difficult, but there's a floor. But a question for Steve Barrett is that a big chunk of our revenue this year is from COVID funding. That doesn't appear to show up in the ALG budget. I think how's that accounted for?
Oh, great question, Mike. So we received a $2,092,000 federal CARES grant. I provided the town manager and the board a summary on that last night. That being said, and I can get into it if you want, but we've had a lot of additional cost as a result of COVID, and the CARES Act money is to, offset those costs. So, in an ideal world, it's a revenue neutral grant, that and our FEMA assistance grant. But, the other thing is just kind of from a high level, if you look at our federal CARES money of, almost $2.1 million, the plan right now is to move close to 900,000 of that to the regional school district. By law, the regional school district is not allowed to apply for CARES Act funding. They are allowed to go to their local community assessment member, so to speak, but they're precluded by law from digging into or to have access to our CARES Act money. So it's true that this funding has come in, or actually it's promised to come in, but it's also true that we've had significant costs, PPE, protective gear. John Mangiarotti pivoted us from brick and mortar to Zoom virtual capability in probably 30 to 45 days, all boards and committees. So we've had a significant cost uptick based on COVID. So I don't.
It didn't have to come out of our. Fortunately, of general revenue because we
Well,
had
no,
special.
it hasn't, Mike, but what's been happening, you know, the guidance started out very general in nature on the FEMA grant as well as the CARES Act. The guidance has been shifting a little bit on us. So, you know, I think that that's, you know, something that we're looking at. It can only be used for items that weren't budgeted for at times as well. So we're, you know, if something wasn't budgeted and we have to pay for it, we have to isolate that cost and get it moved over to the CARES Act. So there's really not a bottom line impact. At best, we're hoping to offset these costs with that CARES Act money.
That's good.
And
Is
also
there?
just the schools.
That's good. Is there a deadline? Like they give us 2.1 and we don't spend 2.1, what happens?
Wow, another great question. You know, the law is written originally had a deadline of December 30th, 2020, 8 days from now, where we had to have everything in stock. We had to have things up and running if we were having, you know, facility improvements.
Right.
As part of the big budget bill, you've heard about that the Senate and Congress approved on the federal level. There is some language in there that extends the deadline a whole year. That has been approved, as you know, by the Congress and the Senate. And, you know, our sources tell us that the president will sign it. So that is very much welcome relief to the management team, you know, that we have some more time to look at that allocation, because the worst thing ever in our world is to have some expense that gets considered not eligible at the federal level, and then we have to find a home for it. So that's welcome relief, and I believe within the next few days, the president should be signing that. Knock on wood. So that's a real game changer with Cisco.
Okay, good. Thank you, Steve. I'm good.
Anyone else? Was that it, Mike? I'm sorry.
I'm good.
Adam.
I think I made a mistake with my numbers when I said floor and ceiling. I believe the floor would be 5% of municipal, which comes out to that 2 million and change. The ceiling would be 3% of total, which comes out to more than 3 million, just as dollar figure floor and ceilings, not percentage floor and ceilings.
Can you back up a second? I have right here 5% of municipal is 1.9 million.
Yeah, roughly. I enveloped it as $2 million. And
So
then
you're saying that would be
3%
the
of the total.
floor, and then 3% I have is 3.285.
Right, which would be the ceiling.
Which is over our current free cash balance of 3.753. A 3% free cash seems like it is a workable number in terms of general guidance. I mean, it's
Right, the total budget, total spend is what, 105 million-ish? Is that right?
something like
Yeah.
109 in this upcoming budget with
Yeah.
big shortfall. Sorry, something strange with my mouth there. Okay, current idea is 3% free cash unless we have support for others. I know Jason doesn't like that. Jason,
Would you entertain a motion at this time?
certainly.
I move that we set a reserve recommendation of a 3% floor and a 5% ceiling of forecasted fiscal total year Acton spend, using certified free cash as the only source of reserves. Furthermore, we recommend that free cash cannot be appropriated if the resultant balance, assuming zero turnbacks, would result in a preceding year certification of less than 3 years of the current year spend.
I'm sorry, you just made a motion?
Yes, ma'am.
Do we have a second? Or is it
Can I
from?
read it again so people can understand it?
I'm
Could you-
honestly not even sure.
But I will second just to hear him explain
Yeah,
it.
thank you. That was the next
Now,
step.
Jason, can you put this up on your screen, whatever what the motion you just read out?
That was going to be my request as well.
Good thinking.
Let me figure out how to do that.
Click share screen at the bottom.
So hold the other computer up to the one.
There you go.
Can I make a comment while he's typing?
Certainly.
Jason, you realize that a 5% ceiling of total Acton spend will be approximately $5 to $6 million. Is that your intention?
Is it stealing? Yes. Yes,
And that's a free cash only policy is what you're proposing?
that's what I'm saying.
Recommend
That's okay.
to result in balances.
What I mean by this is, if we're only going to use free cash, let's only use free cash. And let's only use total Acton spend of 3 to 5%. Furthermore, when you go to take an allocation from free cash, you must assume that in any given year, turnbacks could disappear, could evaporate. So rather than say, we'll use $2 million of free cash and assume it will be returned to us in the form of turnbacks, if you take that $2 million or whatever, 1.6, whatever you want to use in any given year, and that sets the anticipated new free cash level to be less than 3% of that year's total Acton spend, then you have appropriated too much for free cash and cannot do so.
So in this year's case, we would say that the $1.15 million could not be used. It would be the lesser amount.
Up to, it becomes a mathematical formula. They could use up to whatever amount does not pierce the 3% floor of free cash if turnbacks are zero. And I allow for the possibility that turnbacks have happened for years, but I also believe that we have to protect ourselves, and that in any given year, turnbacks could evaporate. So this way, you're guaranteed to always have 3%, and anything you have over that 3% is available to you as part of your budget. You just have to assume that it's gone. If you have a particularly great year and your turnbacks are greater than, then eventually at some point you will drift above the ceiling.
To put this in context, this means that we would believe that $467,946 is available for reserve use this year.
Correct. Thank you for doing the math for me. I didn't have the spreadsheet in front of me.
Christine?
So, Mr. Barrett, if this policy included stabilization, which it doesn't, but if it did, it's not unlike what your current practice is. The 1.1 million you're budgeting to spend brings you down to a 3% floor of those combined reserves. Do I have that right?
Well, our combined would have stabilization in it.
Yeah,
So,
but then it kind of runs that same sort of math. Am I right? Where you say, okay, well, we're only going to spend down to a 3% floor. And
it does. Like if you said, we don't want to get below a 3% floor on both, that, that number's 3.2 million or, something like that, 3.5 million. We have 3.7 in free cash and 2 million in stabilization, or 5.8 million. We'd be okay then. So.
Okay, so it's a similar policy. It's just looking at the free cash as its own bucket. Jason, with this policy, do you anticipate having a separate policy for your thinking on the other reserve buckets?
Yes, I believe we need to revisit the stabilization fund is obviously the next largest source of money. I would want to see the 10-year plan from the town as soon as possible. And we would absolutely make a recommendation about if the $2 million is appropriate to use against that. I believe this would solidify that the stabilization fund must only be used for long-term capital plan, which I've heard from a couple of people tonight. I would also suggest that for the retained earnings of the enterprise funds, I would request a clear laid out expectation of what the reserves, what those retained earnings balances are for, and when we would expect them to be expended and how. So if we really want to go to just using free cash, yes, we absolutely have to approach stabilization and enterprise funds as separate entities that we need to monitor.
I'll support Jason's comment there and say that there need to be policies in place for each of those.
Roland, is your hand up or are you just waving? Okay, Mike? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would, I think this is kind of complicated here. I would maybe support the first sentence and put the rest of it in sort of description, in like our point of view as commentary, or that might explain our thinking, but a 3% floor on free cash as a number is what I would support.
I understand that, sir, but my concern is if you take this, you can then theoretically say, and we're going to use $3 million in free cash because we expect a $3 million turn back. Without the second statement, I believe we're leaving ourselves exposed to an oops year. And I don't believe that that is a sound thing for us to do.
Response, Mike?
Well, yeah, I don't necessarily agree. I think the way the economy is today and these unusual times, I think we go with the 3% and then look at this, agree to revisit it in like 6 months. Once we have the new budget forecast, which will happen in March, and we look at, this is sort of a placeholder, and then look at it again in like whenever we have real numbers for next year. Because I think it's hard to measure the future based on these unusual times today.
Agreed. That's why I don't want to allow us to be, caught off guard by a bad year. I'm trying to set that floor in a more firm mooring. If you don't have the second half of this statement, then you will allow for the possibility of an anticipated turnback that does not materialize, and suddenly we are well below our floor, which we do not wish to be. It's a
Jason, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm just saying it's a protection mechanism.
I agree with the second portion of Jason's statement. However, I don't think I'm prepared to vote on such a statement this evening. I'd like to do some homework on it.
That's why
Okay.
I said look at it in 3 months or so.
Any other comments at this point? Steve?
Yeah, a while ago, maybe a month or two, I think I suggested something like this, which was that we could only appropriate reserve use equal to the amount of the prior year's turnbacks, which would, so if we start at 3% this year, that would kind of accomplish much of what we're talking about here. Doesn't necessarily protect you from the oops year. But
Yeah, but if you do what you just described, if you start at 3% and last year you used 1.6 million, and that 1.6 million does not occur, and the previous year was 1.6 million turnbacks, you're making an assumption that past performance will follow future results. I would prefer that we be a little more protective than that.
well, not exactly, but what I was saying is, you could only appropriate the next year what you actually got in turnbacks the year before.
Right, but if you're at 3%,
It's not predicting performance. But
if you're at
I don't disagree with what you're saying here. There haven't been many but there have been oops years when we didn't get turnbacks, and at the moment we seem to be trending more in that direction than the past performance.
I believe this policy is more conservative than yours because I do not allow them to use last year's turnback as a predictor of next year's turnback. I believe once you tie up the money by saying that it has been appropriated for spend in a given year, you must assume that it's gone until proven otherwise. I'm trying to be more conservative than you on this. And does this mechanism show that level of protection for the floor?
Well, I'm happy with the first sentence. I'm happy with the concept of the second sentence. So we need some way to make sure we don't fall significantly below the 3% floor.
Okay.
Well, we have a motion on the table for the full concept, both sentences.
Christy, could I put forth another question to the
Certainly.
members? I'd like the members' opinions on this 5% ceiling that Jason is putting forth, because it's out of line with the discussion that we've been having, which is for a 3% free cash ceiling based on total Acton spend. And now suddenly we're trying to prepare to vote on a 5% ceiling free cash based on total Acton spend, which is, another $2 million on the table that we've not discussed that as being in the realm of possibilities prior.
Adam, you make me concerned that I've missed something. I don't
think we talked about a ceiling either on a 3% spend.
I don't remember a 3% ceiling.
I have a 5% ceiling.
He means in previous conversations.
Oh, sorry. And my understanding of the 5% ceiling we discussed before was that it was on municipal spend and did not include the school district portion of the budget. That might be where I'm confused.
I think you did come back after your initial proposal and switch your percentages and clear up that you meant.
Right, because my
So
first
we
statement, the
discussed that at
percentages
three.
were in line with what Jason is proposing here. My second statement was that you flip those two percentages so that the
Yeah.
floor is the bigger percentage of a smaller number. The ceiling is the 3%, the smaller percentage of a larger number. Yeah.
You
I
did
was
put that
trying-
out there, but we didn't really discuss it, and I think it's too small myself. I don't think that it's a reasonable window of reserves. Jason, I feel like from the start of the reserves conversation, you've gone from we should spend down the reserves to the reserves shouldn't be spent much lower than they are and should be protected within a narrower window. But is your goal to now protect the bottom of the reserves a little more than maybe when we first started the reserves conversation as it pertains to at least this budget year?
So my positions have been on two separate baselines. My first position is that we consider all of the buckets of money that we have as taxpayer taken money, and that we should bring it down. That is clearly not the position of the wider committee. I would love to see us spend it down and have some taxpayer relief in the meantime. Since that position is not going to fly, I believe that we should set a hard floor and move towards it. A 3% of total Acton spend is what, 3.6 million? So that lowers the amount of money that they are allowed to acquire. That lowers the amount of money that they are allowed to take from reserves to fill the budget gap. And I am absolutely not going to vote for an operating override. So let's give them some guidance on where they need to get to. And if their numbers don't add up, they need to change their spend.
So leaving aside the already mentioned fuzzy math that I don't take seriously yet, the 1.6 million, the ALG plan has 1.1 million in capital, and it sounds like, based on our previous conversation with the town manager, that's the only capital spending in the budget. Obviously, we haven't seen that yet either, but it's easy to see how a town like this could need 1.1 million in capital spending. And using that out of reserves would go below your 3% floor. So would
so if they want to spend it, they got to take it out of stabilization. I agree.
I was going to say, so a reasonable recommendation would be, here's the portion that we think you should take out of reserves, and the rest we think you should take out of stabilization.
To be clear, here's the portion, sorry, you're using reserves when I think you mean free cash.
I am, because sure, free cash as opposed to stabilization.
So I absolutely agree with your proposal that you're trying to explain to the town manager, Christine. I think that, but I also think it's two separate things. If we're going to divorce free cash from stabilization, which was not my original position, my original position was count everything together, but I'm clearly going to lose that argument. If you are going to divorce these different buckets, then the free cash bucket can only be used on the operating side. The stabilization bucket should only be used on the capital side. And if there are capital requests in this year, then the capital should come out of the stabilization fund.
Oh, that's not at all what I'm
No.
getting across from what you've said. So now all capital spending should come out of the stabilization fund?
Yes.
So how are they going to fund capital going forward? They'll have to fund the stabilization fund every year in the amount that they spent on capital?
Or they're going to have a capital override, a Prop 2.5. Okay, sorry.
So there'll be no saving for capital projects at all? No possibility of pre-planning to pay for a roof or an HVAC system or any other capital needs that might come up for the town?
They've got a $2 million bucket right now for capital expenditures, and we've been asking for years for a capital plan. We received the third party outside assessment, I think 6 years ago now.
Let's for a second give this town manager his due in that he's only been in the job for 2 years, and that he is now coming to us in the near future with a 10-year capital plan and that he brought to the budget process the last couple of years a 3 to 5 year capital plan. But regardless, I feel that if you want all capital spending to come out of the stabilization fund, that means that we have to regularly fund the stabilization fund for these capital expenditures, because capital expenditures are part of a town, and we don't want to have to go to bond or outside of the budget for every little capital project that's going to come up.
Again, that's why my original plan was to count all of the reserves in one big bucket. But
I don't think it's why does it have to be all or nothing? We had free cash and stabilization, and you're saying we either have to have just free cash or free cash, stabilization, E&D, stabilization, and enterprise funds, and I don't think that that's a one or two.
Steve?
Okay, so you could have a budget item every year that funds a capital stabilization. So the plan for the school one was to use turnbacks. I don't know that they're getting any more turnbacks than the town is at this point, so they may have to go back to putting a specified budget line item in to fund their stabilization. So the funding of a stabilization fund can be done in a couple of different ways. It can be done from turnbacks. It can be done as a line item. The spending can be out of the stabilization fund or out of the general fund budget. The problem with, I think, and Steve Barrett, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the problem with doing all your spending out of a stabilization fund is you're putting it up to a 2/3 vote at town meeting as opposed to a simple majority.
Absolutely.
This is a significant departure from our stated policy and guidance and everything I've read of the idea of using free cash to offset the operating budget. If we're saying that stabilization is the only way to pay for capital expenses, then there's either no reason to spend free cash in our worlds, or we are completely changing our guidance for what free cash can be used for.
Well, you can use free cash to replenish your stabilization fund too.
Yeah, we've said for years and years, do not use free cash for operating, use it only for capital. So town manager heard that and used it for capital, and now you're saying use it for operating if you need it.
That's not true.
Otherwise, use stabilization. Is that
That's not true. We've been using free cash for multiple years with the expectation of turnback.
the last 2 years we've used it for capital only
Yes,
with the expectation of turnback, which is what we asked the town manager to do.
For the last 2 years, that's true. But if you go back for the previous however many years,
You have a new boss.
that ship has sailed though. Do we want to set our policy based on that? We finally have someone who's,
that's why I'm being so careful about setting the floor. That's why I'm being so protective of setting the floor.
I don't follow that.
There is no risk to the floor being pierced if the turnbacks are always greater than or equal to the amount of money appropriated by free cash. That is what the whole purpose of the second statement, second line is.
I don't have a problem with a 3% floor. It was everything you said after that about using stabilization for capital. Where you lost me.
Sorry. Jason, did you have a response?
No.
Anyone else?
Can we figure out how to strike the second sentence and put in just a flat, under no circumstances should the free cash fall below 3%?
How do you protect against that?
I'm not trying to be so prescriptive. I'm just trying to state a position. I'm not trying to tell them how to do it or what to do, but that we don't. A floor is a floor, and just to make a point of emphasis that it is a floor in our minds, and we don't want to see it pierced.
Adam?
I move that we vote on the
Hold on,
first
we're-
half of
we're in a
Jason's
motion.
statement and
Now we're
strike
in motion.
the,
Can't do that.
Yeah.
sorry.
We are mid-motion.
Having heard no second.
But we got a second.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the second.
Steve, can you withdraw your second, or do we need to vote? And do you want to? You are welcome
I
to.
believe we need to vote.
We need to
Right.
vote.
We need to vote. Because once we had the first and the second, and then we would open up for discussion.
Unless Jason wants to amend his motion, then I would gladly withdraw my second.
I am not comfortable amending this because I believe that if we are not very prescriptive, it allows for too much opportunity for ignoring the guidance and saying, oops, sorry, we had a bad time.
Jason, I agree with that. I don't think that we should hastily vote on the wording of that this evening. I think we can add it at the next meeting if everybody else agrees.
I see no hands up. Oh, Christine.
I think ALG is our time to hold to our 3% floor. I think that instances where they dip below that 3% floor are we would either see the budget as unreasonable and we would not approve it, or we would see the need to spend the reserves because of crisis circumstances and approve it, whether that language is there or not. So I'm not sure that it's even necessary.
No future protection for the floor, but okay.
Okay. Apologies. We have a motion. It is time for a vote. I will do this by roll call. Jason,
Aye.
Adam,
No.
Roland,
No,
Steve,
Aye.
Mike,
No,
Isha. I know it doesn't count, but
Abstain.
Christine,
No.
Sahana.
No.
All right. Christy, I say no. Would someone like to make a second motion?
I will make a motion that we vote to set a free cash policy with a floor of 3% of the total Acton spend and a ceiling of 5% of the total Acton spend. And with the intent that in the future, we will qualify that per the second half of Jason's previous motion.
Do you want to include that last sentence in your motion?
I retract the last sentence, please.
Do we have a second?
second.
Wonderful. Okay. We have a motion. We're having a vote. Sorry.
We can have discussion first.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, debate, discussion.
Could we have it so that we say that, you know, it's a floor of 3%, a ceiling of 5% with not to violate the floor? In other words, not to drop below the floor.
We can do that, but that would mean another motion.
In the end, this is just a recommendation.
We can also have a second.
Or that we recommend that we do not go below the floor. The floor is the floor.
Yeah,
I
that's
would-
why it's called a policy recommendation.
Yeah, I would hope that that's what the floor means. Jason has a different point there with his recommendation. It's about making sure that the floor is fully funded. Correct?
Correct. There's no protection mechanism without it.
But that said, we are simply discussing the floor and ceiling as Adam spoke right now. Any more questions, debate? All right, time for a vote. Jason,
Nay.
Adam,
Aye.
Roland,
Aye.
Steve,
Aye.
Mike,
aye.
Isha,
Abstain.
Christine,
Aye.
Sahana,
Yes.
and Christy, I say aye. The motion passes. Would we like to further discuss the idea of enforcing the availability of the reserves that Jason has put forward, or would we like to put that off to another discussion?
I think we should have that at our next meeting. I do think it's a valid point and it's important, and that we should really consider that we make sure, so we get some, I think it just adds more guidance to the whole thing. So that we're
I
not
agree. I
buying-
think it's very prudent guidance, Roland, and I look forward to getting a better explanation of Jason's intent and make sure that I can work through the numbers so that I feel very clear on making a vote.
The next meeting is before January's ALG meeting, so if anyone has any concerns about that.
When is our next meeting?
1 second.
And then also, is that when CPC, we have invited?
Yes.
CPC to the-
Yes, CPC will be here. Then this is on January 12th.
I'll follow up with CPC as well.
Thank you.
Our next meeting is the 12th,
Yes,
2022.
and ALG is on
21,
Thursday the
excuse me.
14th. Yes.
Don't get ahead of us, Mike.
I think you're taking a year off?
Right.
Mike,
Not a bad idea.
Scared me, Mike.
We lost a year, might as well take a year off, right?
Okay, something I would also like to discuss at the next meeting is the implications we have on the ALG spreadsheet for our current floor recommendation. Lowers the reserve spending below what they are currently, has as an assumption in the spreadsheet. But that is something for us to, I believe, think about for another time, unless there is desire to discuss it now.
Well, I think when you look at it, then they're relying on reserves to balance the budget. And we strongly recommended that for the last, heck, as long as I've been on the committee, I think, which is going on at least 8 years now, maybe a little bit longer, that they do not do that.
So
That's
what
a
Mayor
good point.
Mangiarotti has said is that the capital expense line in there is for one-time capital expenses. They presumably would be funded in the budget, in the municipal budget, if they were not paid for there.
And then that goes to my other point that use a stabilization fund to help fund those funds.
We have not discussed a policy around that. But that could also be for another time unless people want to do it now.
Maybe we should wait that for the next one as well,
All right,
my opinion. I don't know what the other committee members feel.
one second, I'm gonna take some notes on this.
Adam, if you hit Alt-A, that will unmute you. Instead of touching the screen all the time.
Are you on a tablet?
No, I'm on a tablet.
Sorry.
Did you wash your hands, Adam?
Twice.
Okay, so at the next meeting, in addition to having the CPC there, we will discuss a stabilization fund usage policy, explore the idea of having a protection for the overspending relative to the floor. And there was something else. Oh, reserve usage in the fiscal year 22 projections.
Can we talk about that now?
I'm game?
Reserve usage, we've now set a policy. We've now set a policy that I believe is a little too open-ended, but now that we've set a policy, the amount of money that they wish to acquire from free cash should not violate our policy. If the 1.6 that they're asking for now would violate our policy, then it should be made clear in the next ALG meeting that some other remedy has to be taken care of to close that shortfall, and that a Prop 2.5 override is not one that I believe we should even consider.
Just to clarify, since I have the sheet in front of me, there is an assumption currently of a $1.15 million reserve use with that in there, there is a $1.65 million shortfall. So we
Okay.
are adding,
So
So that's-
so please do the math, figure out what 3% of next year's proposed budget is. Find out what we have in free cash. If what we have in free cash is less than that 3%, then we have a problem. If what we have in free cash is greater than that 3%,
okay,
find the difference and apply it and say that's it.
3% of the total Acton spend next year is $3.285 million, which
And we
leaves $467,946 to be used for
Then I believe that is the maximum amount of money that this committee that just voted, 7-1, recommends should be allowed to be used towards next year's fiscal budget, and that should be what we recommend at ALG.
Out of free cash with the
Out of free cash.
remainder of the capital 1.1 perhaps out of stabilization,
Yep.
and the 1.6 million that we don't know anything about.
Shortfalls
We
are
are over
shortfalls.
once they actually show us a budget and we confirm that there is a $1.6 million budget gap.
Right. I suspect that suddenly we will not have a $1.6 million budget shortfall if they find out there's not a reserve wall that they can tap from. And if there is, then I do believe we have recommended that we share the burden and share the responsibility and share the quote unquote blame for any reductions in services, whatnot, because we did offer to have a cost saving joint committee. Since that was not well received, our recommendation is a 3% floor, and we strongly encourage them to find a way to get there.
thoughts, feelings? Steve?
Well, I mean, we didn't make up the 3% number. The town manager cited several sources, credible sources, saying you should have a floor of 3%. We're just making recommendations on what would be considered best practices. So, as far as, what happens with the ALG plan, well, we should be further along than we are, but it's early days in ALG negotiations. Their numbers may come down. Their numbers may not come down. If they don't come down, we have a problem. I'd be happy for this committee to put in the point of view that we don't support an override for this year. That's something we always used to lead our point of view comments with. But since they won't share any budget information, again, we're working with less than perfect information. So my sense is I would be happy to defend the 3%, and I would show the town manager and board of selectmen the same documents she showed us.
So whose name is on there?
That sounds good to me. Do we want to make a motion or just
Oh,
continue
good.
viewing this as a general?
Sure enough.
I move that we
With a gift certificate?
recommend not to allow I move that we recommend not to recommend a Prop 2.5 override for the next fiscal year.
Do we have a second? Roland, was that a second? You're muted.
Sorry, that was a second. I forgot.
All right. Debate?
I mean, I think it could be sufficient to say in the point of view that we don't see that the Prop 2.5 operating override is necessary. Because at the moment, I don't think it's necessary.
Christine?
Yeah, they're not asking for it. I don't know that we need to make an official vote on this. It's almost always our position that we don't want an operating override. And we've been warning against them in our point of view for years.
I just think it might be a good year to explicitly state that. And I don't know if you need a motion actually, we probably should have a vote to say we don't want to see an operating override this year.
My concern is if we all of a sudden take away a fair chunk of their amount of money they can spend from reserves, then they're going to come back and say, well, if you won't let us spend the reserves, then we have to have a Prop 2.5 override. And I believe we should box that out.
Yeah, I agree.
So my
Yes.
only concerns along that line is that we're in such a weird time relative to not knowing the COVID-related expenses that I don't want to walk in and say, you can't spend anything, and find out that we have all of these absolutely necessary bills.
We could amend the motion to say absent, an issue with unreimbursed COVID expenses. That leaves the door open.
I would accept that amendment.
Okay? So I'm sorry, Roland has the second. Did you?
Yeah, I'll resolve that. That's fine.
Mike, could you mute? Huh, sorry, I'm just talking to my kids. Everyone's at home.
Are you from
You're muted, Mike.
Mutes when he talks.
Yes.
I was saying, are you from Baltimore?
No.
We're all Huns.
Yep. Okay. We have a motion and we have it seconded. We've had debate unless anyone would like to add anything to this. I see no hands up, so let's go ahead and have a vote. Jason,
Aye.
Adam,
I would like Jason to please restate the motion for me, please.
I believe as stated that the motion on the floor, just to make sure we're all voting on the same thing, is that the Finance Committee does not recommend a Proposition 2.5 override this year, barring any unforeseen material COVID-19 related expenses. Roland, you were the second. Do you agree with that stated motion?
Yes.
all right. Adam, that's what you're voting on.
Thank you. I'm just jotting this down. I want to make sure I got the whole thing.
Oh yeah, you gotta get this for secretary purposes.
Yes, and Jason voted aye,
Yes.
and
correct.
I shall vote aye.
Roland,
Aye.
Steve,
Aye.
Mike. You're muted.
Yeah, I vote aye, but Steve, Mr. Barrett has us covered for the COVID-19 piece.
Isha,
Aye.
Christine,
Aye.
and I'm Christy. I say aye. I'm saying that my name in case anyone's listening, not watching us. Feels a little strange. Okay. I believe that's it for right now. Do we have anything we want to say on the POV, or should we tackle that after? Mike, please.
It unmutes on the screen, but not down below, at least the symbol. So I move that we all have a happy holiday and Merry Christmas and see you in January.
I second that.
Don't second it, then we have to vote on it.
Do we have to vote on it? Can you withdraw
I
that?
retract my second.
Thank you.
My second was in spirit, not in.
Quickly, we have no meeting minutes to review. Does anyone have any committee reports? Jason?
Two reports. One, the school building committee has received guaranteed maximum price. Many of the trade bids came in to the favorable to the good. As a result, all of the heretofore contingencies that had been at risk have been replenished, and we do have a final guaranteed maximum price. Sorry, I don't have the number in front of me right now. And the guaranteed maximum price is well within line of the amount of money that was voted on at special town meeting 2 Novembers ago. Second committee report, the capital improvement committee on the school side is moving forward with its 13-year plan. There was a zeroing out of the monies received from operations towards the capital improvement for our current fiscal year. And the original proposed budget from the superintendent was to keep that sorry, let me rephrase. In the current fiscal year, the money appropriated from the main budget only covered the cost of the bond payment for the $7.5 million bond that was taken out. With no additional funding of the SIP, capital improvement plan. For the next fiscal year, that was also the expectation, or also the ask of the superintendent, if the SIP subcommittee would sign off on a similar, barely covering the bond payment and not including new monies. We, as a subcommittee, pushed back and said that we would like the amount of money that was anticipated in the original 13-year plan to be brought back in as quickly as possible over the next 2 or 3 years, so that the 13-year plan stays intact or as close to intact as possible. We have not heard back from the superintendent, and we've not seen the actual AVRSD budget to see if the SIP plan is being, if the monies for that SIP plan have been restored or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Adam?
I think probably all of you received the email about the WR Grace plan meeting for February 3rd coming up. What you may not know is that they're also proposing a meeting February 16th to meet with the planning board to present their plan for the solar farm that they want to put on the WR Grace site. And then the only other thing from the planning board is that the 22 Elm Street project continues to get pretty fierce opposition from a couple of different community groups in Acton, and I believe that's still an ongoing debate.
What
Anyone
is
else?
the 22 Elm Street?
It's right across from the school there. It's a single family residence with enough property for multiple housing development, but there's some wetland involved. And so there's some contention based on how much actual land area there is versus how many homes and condominiums they want to build in the space.
Is that right across from the fields?
Is it the farm?
Correct.
So what's the, so they're trying to figure out what they can put on that property now, is that?
Yeah, and the proposal is for 6 additional condominium units, and Green Acton and some other residents are saying that's too many units not based on the lot size, but based on the usable lot size once you factor out the wetlands.
So is it a total of 6 units, or is it a total of more?
Well, the house that's currently there, plus the plan I saw showed 6 additional units. What I don't know is if those units are specifically single family or whether some of those are condominium. It's difficult to tell without really digging into the description.
Good. Anyone else? Isha?
I don't have anything else to add.
No, you get to make a motion now.
Oh. We motion that we adjourn. I motion that we adjourn this meeting.
Second. Wonderful. Jason?
Aye.
Adam?
Aye.
Roland?
Aye.
Steve?
Aye.
Mike?
Aye.
Isha?
Aye.
Christine?
Aye.
And Christy, I say aye. Thank you, everyone. I know this has been a difficult discussion, but I think we got somewhere good with it. Appreciate all your input.
Happy holidays.